Welcome to this edition of Public Affairs Public Access, brought to you by the League of Women Voters Houston area and Houston Media Source. My name is Quentin Wiltz with the League of Women Voters, and I'll be your host and moderator for this event. This current edition, we'll focus on a topic that hasn't been talked about for nearly 16 years and has somehow found its way back into the mainstream and the spotlight, and that's the recount. So just when we thought we could move on from the 2016 elections, here we are. So, and here tonight, or this edition, to talk to us, we've got several panelists, but that does not exclude you, viewers at home. If you'd like to join the discussion, we encourage you to do so. The number is 713-807-1794. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest panelists. With us this edition, we have George Ryder with the Harris County Green Party. We've got Mr. Morad Fiqi with the Harris County GOP. Yes. And we've got Mr. John Behrman with the Harris County Democratic Party. So we've got a broad spectrum here of insight and opinion, and I'll not take too much more time, but let's get into it. And if you could, just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do, and give us some insight as to maybe some expertise on how you fit into this topic. So, Mr. Ryder?
Well, I'm a professor of physics at the University of Houston. I also have a radio show on KPFT at 7 p.m. on Fridays called Thresholds. And I've been a member of the Green Party since about 2000 and been co-chair of the Harris County Green Party off and on for about 7 years.
Okay.
Actually, there was you made a mistake.
Okay, I'll admit that. I'll take it.
The recount that was done in the first Gore-Bush election, that's sort of famous.
Okay.
But there was a recount done in 2004, also called for by the Green Party candidates, actually in that case in alliance with the Libertarian candidates in Ohio.
Okay.
Which actually resulted in some people going to jail eventually, and changes in the way people dealt with these electronic voting machines. So the Green Party's had a history of being concerned about voting being actually accurately counted for some time. And there's really, Jill Stein doing this is part of that tradition.
Okay. Well, good insight, and I'm glad you brought that up because that'll be a topic of discussion later on. So, okay. Mr. Morad?
Yes, I'm a luxury home consultant and broker associate with Keller Williams, deal with high-end properties. Before then, I'm also a veteran, U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines, and I love our country.
Okay.
So it's been very active with the Harris County Republican Party since I've been back since 2013.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Behrman?
This is my 52nd year of working in elections. I've been involved in recounts here at the county level. I was master of a recount in Webb and Zapata counties in a primary election. That's kind of the FA Cup of refereeing elections. I was most recently the presiding judge in my own precinct. 2012, I was presiding judge of the ballot board for all of Harris County. I've been about as far up in election work as you can get without ever being paid. And I really look forward to what, if anything, we can learn from this. The recounts I've participated in the past are very, very interesting, sort of tedious, but you learn things that you don't learn at any other time in the election cycle.
Okay. So I guess the first question that I want to kind of put out there is why would you call a recount? And let's just kind of speak in terms, we know that this is a grand deal with the national federal elections, but let's try to keep it down on a scale that we can relate to how it would affect us here locally. So why would you call a recount? For instance, when we've had elections, why no recounts here?
Well, if it's close enough, right, that you think that either just due to random errors or due to systematic exploitation and weaknesses in the system, that the result can be changed by recounting them, which actually would have happened in 2000 in Florida if they'd all been recounted, as it turned out. It would just be in the interests of the people who lost, certainly, to have the recount done. And I was surprised, actually, that Hillary Clinton didn't do it. It seemed to make sense in Pennsylvania and the 3 states that were done. It was pretty close. So that's certainly the reason for people who are directly involved in it. And again, as I said, the Green Party has an interest in the integrity of the vote. And so from that point of view, also, even if you were doing random checks, it would be a good idea to occasionally recount the votes.
Okay, so now, Mr. Fiki, I know you and I spoke briefly and then some information was exchanged, but you have a different perspective in that I believe you run previously or in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. I ran for the Texas House of Representatives in 2014.
Okay.
I lost that race by about 1,900 votes, and I wasn't demanding a recount.
And so why was that? I mean, why? Like in this case, why? There's a lot at stake, but in yours, there's just as much at stake. So why not call for a recount?
I think the integrity of the elections here in Harris County is it's pretty good. I mean, we use, I ran the election in my precinct this past election, and we use electronic voter machines, which takes the vote record and actually saves it to the hard drive on site. So these votes are not transmitted over the internet. It's pretty close to impossible to hack them because it's a closed circuit. So I'm not a huge, I'm not going to get all in the weeds, but it's a closed circuit. You're not transmitting them. So besides allowing somebody to vote twice or vote 3 times, or allowing people to vote who should not be voting, like somebody who's not a citizen, and at that point they've already voted. I mean, on the rolls. So the best thing we can do to keep the integrity going is make sure that the voters who are voting are on the voter rolls. And if they are, I mean, what are we going to recount? We're going to retabulate what the system has saved to it already. So I had even spoke to our Harris County clerk, Stan Stannard, about this. And he said, if there was a recount, the voter change in Harris County would probably be, 2 votes or something completely insignificant. And so you have Hillary Clinton who lost these states. She's down by about 100,000 votes. Do you really believe that she's going to make up that difference? Were the votes so skewed, or was the election so far dishonest that she's going to make up 100,000 votes? And therefore, is it worth the cost that the taxpayers are going to have to foot the bill for? Jill Stein raised some money for this, but not nearly enough for what it's actually going to cost.
So would you care to comment, Mr. Behrman? He touched on a lot of different things.
I can certainly agree with a good deal of what both of the panelists have said. With regard to using a recount to examine the integrity of the election process, the machines, what the Green Party did in Ohio, I've done that. And in some cases, it's your only way to get into the weeds with the election process, because it's governed by statutes and proprietary secrecy agreements, ministerial secrecy. So to find out what's really going on, one technique is to have a recount and follow up the recount with a contest. In fact, that's what happened in Zapata County. And that was the first chance to learn a great deal about the direct recording electronic voting machines that we use in Texas. Unfortunately, the forensic expert's report was sealed by the court at the request of the vendor. But you can do that. I just don't understand why you would do it in this large an election. You find out the most, and there's the highest probability of irregularities, tiny little elections that nobody's paying much attention to. So I would love it if we find out something interesting about this election, but I seriously doubt that we will in the 3 states that Jill Stein has challenged. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, needs to spend its money in the close race in North Carolina for governor. A, it's a much closer race, and B, there have been substantial allegations of all sorts of irregularities in the course of that election. So I would hope the Democratic Party would drill down into that particular race. I don't think they're going to find much very interesting in the 3 races that have been challenged.
So you mentioned earlier about, I think you brought up voter fraud, and you also brought the machines and how the machines take the information and store them and they don't transmit them. Well, and maybe you could just clarify, but whenever the votes are taken, is there any way to audit each vote to make sure that so many people within that hour, those votes were tabulated according to the person or persons they voted for?
The only way that we can audit the voter machines is counting the actual number of votes and matching that with the voter rolls, and those numbers should match. Meaning, if there are 1,632 votes counted, and then there are 1,800 people who could have voted in this precinct, but 1,632 should have voted. If that's what it, if those numbers don't match, if 1,800 people voted in this precinct, yet there's 1,600 who are registered to vote, that's a problem. And that has happened in Harris County.
Yes.
Many times. And, I'm sorry to say that, but almost always it has been in Democrat precincts where the voter count is higher than the rolls. Am I
John,
wrong?
you're shaking your head.
We do that. We have a reconciliation of the sign-in book and the election results in every single election. And there are a few discrepancies that really have to do with clerical error in the manual bookkeeping that goes on as a rule. Nonetheless, when we had a recount here in 2004, a very close race where the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee in the Texas legislature was overthrown by, out of the blue, by very unexpected and a very close race. Well, not the recount. Recount is a ritual. It's not very rigorous. But there was enough evidence in the recount to focus on the voter roll and who was voting. So every single discrepancy between the books and the registration and all of that sort of stuff was gone into in basically a very expensive lawsuit. It didn't affect the outcome of the race. A few votes changed one way or the other. The great irony is that despite this sort of meme that Democrats are voting illegally wholesale, the most egregious outcome of that actual recount here in Harris County was we found a non-citizen who had voted when he was put under oath and deposed. He was drummed into a campaign by the Republicans. He voted straight Republican, but he was a Danish citizen. Well, at first everybody got excited. That's a felony in this state. However, when they looked at the Republican tax assessor collector's records, he had very carefully put on his application to vote that he was not a citizen. So he was not charged with anything because it's the tax assessor collector's responsibility to not register somebody who swears and affirms they're not a citizen. A lot of money was spent. The outcome didn't change. The results, however, were very interesting, but we don't have time for all those anecdotes.
So what I guess what the typical person is used to is when you say recount, there is a physical tabulation or counting of the information. But if you have an electronic machine, you're only taking the summation, but you're not physically counting anything. So would you say that recounts are ineffective when you have digital machines in place, whereas other places have paper or other means that you can individually verify and audit?
Well, my understanding actually is in 2 of the states, there is in fact a paper trail, so to speak, and in Pennsylvania there isn't. I don't know what can be done when there isn't. I'm not really an expert in that sort of thing. But even in an electronic system, if there's been hacking done, it tends to leave a record. And if you are good enough at knowing how to look for it, you might find it. So it's even in the electronic systems, it seems to me, there is something to be learned by going back and checking the records. So my understanding also is that, and it's been a long time since I was involved in this, but actually the machines that do the counting, that the precinct chairs or judges actually get to take them home before the election. Is that correct? And presumably one could fiddle with them when you had them at home.
Well, we have 3 kinds of voting in Harris County. We have absentee voting, which is a paper ballot that's optically scanned and then tabulated. We also have early voting, which is mechanically done the same way as on Election Day. And then on Election Day, maybe a third, fourth of the votes are cast right there. Now, the votes that are cast on Election Day, there's a tabulation of them at the end, and the precinct judge can take that home. I took it home, but I don't bother to read it. I mean, most of the people in my precinct voted early or absentee. It's not
You don't
very
actually take home the box that does the counting, do you?
No.
Okay.
The boxes go directly back to the county. There's a very elaborate chain of custody regime for the little cards that have all the cast vote records in them. It wasn't always the case. There's been years of back and forth criticism, and every year the process has been improved. Things I complained about in 2005 are not done anymore.
Yeah, and if I can interject,
But it's a very it'll be impossible in a recount to find evidence of hacking. But what happens in a recount is everything that happened in the election gets recorded. I was a poll watcher at the early voting ballot board in the early voting sites. If I saw anything that was worth investigating and there was a recount going on, I would tell the people in the recount and they would follow up on that. So, but in a gigantic election like a presidential election, it's very, very hard to run down the details of anomalies that are usually very small.
yeah, if I can interject to answer your question, yes, we do have the ability to take those home because you pick them up on Saturday or Sunday prior to the election. So you do take them home. However, they're sealed, so they have a seal from the Harris County Clerk's office. And then when we open the polls on that Tuesday, there's the Democrat precinct judge, the Republican precinct judge. We open those together. So we verify that they're still sealed. They haven't been tampered with. When we connect the system, then we run the roll. So we run a count. And it has to be what we call a zero count. So it has to say, 0 votes, 0 people have voted, 0 for all these races, and it runs through that. And if it's not zeroed out, then somebody has to, we have a direct line to the county clerk's office. We have to call them, and that's a huge problem, because that's a felony. That is a huge problem.
So is there a way to, throughout the day, is there periodic audits that go on throughout the day? That
We
say
do.
after
We count
500.
we count the rolls. We say, okay, you know, at 9:30, at 11:30, every 2 hours, we count. We run the system. How many votes has the system recorded? And then we look at the voter rolls. So when someone comes in, they sign in to vote. We verify their ID. They are who they say they are. Then they sign. They physically sign, say, okay, I'm here, I'm voting. Then they get a number, and they go vote. So when the system records the vote, when they're done voting, the system records it. We run that every 2 hours. There's 185 people who voted up to this point. Count the rolls. It should be 185 people signed in, and that's how you know that it's accurate.
So now you were shaking your head, John? Because we talked about it earlier, and you said in Harris County it occurred
in
when there was...
California, they did what's called a top-to-bottom review, including a review of the machines we use here in Harris County. And from that process, they developed and implemented by statute a real audit. I mean, the thing about an audit is it has to be carefully prepared even before the election starts. There's a testing and auditing regime. We do these various reconciliation things. We maintain a chain of custody and we cross-check some things, but it's not even close to what a professional auditor would demand be done. Because, and this is a problem with a recount. A recount, you collect anecdotes from the election after the election is over, and you try to find out if something went wrong. In an audit, you've prepared what you're going to be examining after the election a year before the election. And we don't do that. Our elections are too frantic. And now we have a real problem. If you're worried about hacking, what you look for is a machine that fails, because an attempt to hack usually just breaks the machine. It usually doesn't work. Well, our machines are now so old that quite a few of them fail during the election, have to be swapped out, replaced, all sorts of things happen. You know, this makes you nervous if you're worried about hacking. I've never seen evidence of hacking, but there are enough of these things that make you worry about it. And I've never seen it here in Harris County. You've seen there are enough things that go wrong that it increases your suspicion. And I really wish we had a more complete testing and auditing regime, because then these anomalies would not lead to rumors and a lack of confidence. I mean, an election is very complicated, so there are going to be lots of errors. But if you find the errors and you correct the errors and you prevent things like hacking, as opposed to batteries failing or something, you know, people can have a lot of confidence in the elections. I was working for a particular candidate in the closest race in the county, and I was looking for anything that would lead us to open up a recount if my candidate lost. Well, my candidate won, but the fact is, I never saw anything in the election that would be grounds for asking for a recount.
So, kind of back to the where we kind of started, right? I mean, Jill Stein said, "Let's have this." There were, as a basis, like you said, a history of precedent established where a recount was done and people were jailed. So could you talk about that instance in Ohio specifically?
I don't know much of the details about that. There were questions about the Secretary of State in Ohio was actually a principal in Diebold, which was the machines that were being used, and was a Republican partisan. And much more than that, I don't know. I'm told that the effect of that was that people pulled back on using Diebold machines, and that serious discrepancies were found. That there was clearly attempt to rig the outcome.
Okay, so we won't speculate, but Jill Stein is calling for a 3-state recount. Okay, and Murad, you mentioned earlier that it's going to cost taxpayer dollars.
Oh.
Well, she's raising money, correct?
Well, she's raised a lot of money.
Yes.
I don't know, about $7.5 million.
She's raised more than she raised in her campaign.
Way more.
Yes.
And this is not all.
Which is a red flag, right there.
Well,
Well, I'll let you.
this is not all. This is not all from Green Party
Sure.
people. What it says to me is that there's a lot of people that wanted to see that recount done. She raised about $2 million in about a day and a half. So there's a lot of people who sense and that it's worth doing, and who suspect that the elections are not fair.
So when you say red flag, what do you mean?
I mean, if she raised more money for the recount than for her whole campaign, it's clear that this is a political ploy to get attention. Again, the election's been decided. This was not a close election. He crushed the election. And between those 3 states, he's up about 100,000 votes. Not 1,000, 100,000 votes. There has never been a recount. Look at past history. There's never been a recount that has provided even remotely close to that many votes swinging the other way. Especially when you have electronic devices. The vote's been recorded already. You know, if we're going to do a recount here in Harris County, I haven't been a part of one, but what would we have to do if we're going to recount the precincts? We're going to have to look and see what the machines hold, because there's no paper ballots to count. So, you know, this isn't even coming from Hillary Clinton. This is coming from the 4th place loser in this race. And she got about 1% of the vote. So, you know, saying that, well, I just want to make sure that the system has integrity and so on and so forth. That's great. I think we all do. But it's clearly a political ploy.
So if it's a political ploy, then the candidate that won majority of electoral votes, overwhelmingly,
Right.
has also said that there's voter fraud. So it goes to delegitimizing the system in which he won. So how do you, in turn, try to establish some sort of legitimate system to then call one person the winner of the election? It becomes difficult, right? So when you said red flag, that's why, I mean, I get it. Like, how do you raise so much money? But to your point, I think because of the popular vote difference versus the electoral vote, there are some feelings involved, correct? As to, well, why don't we focus on popular voters for electoral college? And that's another topic. We're focusing strictly on the recount. But so there's questions that are raised from both sides. And so, you know, pushing this issue of recount, we just want to try to delve into what it really means, right? So, John, I know you were scratching for something there.
No.
Okay, all right.
Well, I mean, if
That's
I can
a very
answer,
good summary.
Yeah, if I can answer that question, you're saying, so Donald Trump won the election overwhelmingly. And I do believe after the final tabulation, he won the majority vote as well. I think in the beginning, you know, he
Majority of what? Of each state?
No, majority vote. I think the final count, he's up in the majority vote when they counted everything.
I thought there was.
I thought he was 2 million down.
2 million down.
We'll look at that right now, but I do believe I'd have to double check that. So, but that's a separate topic.
Okay.
To answer your question, so he said, you know, that there's illegal voting, there's voter fraud, and she's asking for a recount. So that's not. If we're going to look at the voter fraud, illegals voting, people who shouldn't be voting, I believe that's what Donald Trump was talking about. And in every election, there has been voter fraud. I think Governor Greg Abbott, when he was Attorney General, he prosecuted a number of voter fraud cases here in Texas, prosecuted. So that's only what we found. And if you're looking at that, then it's saying, okay, looking for situations where there have been voter fraud, where voters vote twice, 3 times, where dead people vote, where people who should not be voting vote. And that happens. But she wants to just recount the votes and make sure that this vote for Hillary Clinton is a vote for Hillary Clinton, that we counted the votes correctly. We're not looking at, hey, did these people vote who shouldn't have been voted? That's something else.
So now I saw different laughs. I mean, no jokes were told, so I'm trying to figure out what the laughs.
Well, I think the notion that there's something like 2 million votes which are voter fraud is just absurd. This whole question about voter fraud has been looked at over time, and the numbers of people who've actually been convicted of voter fraud is insignificant compared to the numbers of people who are voting.
And that's who was caught.
Yeah. Well, it's presumably proportional to the number caught, and when it's that insignificant, this is really not a problem. This is just a sort of talking point for the Republican Party. So I think that's just not an issue. The question of whether you're rigging elections because you have an ability to manipulate the system, it's a separate issue altogether.
And that's the point that I was making. If you're counting the votes, that is a separate topic from saying people who voted illegally were able to vote. You're still counting those votes. You're counting people who've already voted, and you're legitimizing that the vote counts are correct, to my understanding. So
we mentioned the machines here in Harris County, right? And these machines are pretty much widely used throughout Texas, correct? There are very few places within Texas that use things other than the DREs.
The largest number of counties use the HART machines, the HART tabulation equipment. Harris and Travis counties are 2 huge counties that use the same machines. One of them has a Democratic county clerk, the other has a Republican county clerk. In Zapata County, those were HART machines. The tabulation equipment was the same, but those people had all marked paper ballots, and those were scanned in the precinct. So we were counting the same little cards in the central counting station, but in the recount, we went back and we got all of those paper ballots, and we had people sitting there, and guess what? The paper ballot count was exactly the same as what came out of the tabulation equipment. But that was, it was perfect. You could look at every single ballot and compare those results in the one race with the results on the machine. But in Harris and Travis counties, the recount of the early votes and the precinct votes is really a meaningless exercise. I mean, they just print out the cast vote records on a piece of white paper, and then people sit there and recount them. I mean, it's a perfect waste of time. The importance...
It has to check with the electronic record, though, right?
Well, in Harris County, the electronic record is used to generate a piece of paper.
But it's also forwarded as an electronic.
Yes.
So there's really two paths by which these numbers come together, and indeed they should come together.
But it's all electronic in Harris County except for the absentee ballots. Now we had a recount of absentee ballots on my watch in 2012. Just the absentee ballots, and again the paper ballots, when they were examined, came out with the same result as the absentee column in the accumulation of the votes. Now, people get to argue with paper ballots, was that really a check? With the paper ballots we use here in Harris County, there's a certain amount of subjectivity involved in looking at the paper ballots and deciding what was that person doing when they had a pen and a piece of paper. But again, that's been controversies in the Democratic primary, in the Republican primary. The paper ballots, the use of the paper ballots it's a real paper trail. You can have, in the recount, you can have a genuine audit. In fact, in California, every single race, every single election, they do a statistical sampling of those paper ballots, and they use that to verify the result. That builds confidence in the integrity of the election. What's damaging in elections is when there are things that just look odd, and then people start spreading rumors, and every time the rumor spreads, the outrage gets higher. That's very damaging, because it doesn't matter who wins. If the election is shrouded in rumors, everybody gets upset. And now, the problem with charges about who's voting, a recount doesn't get to that. You have to have a contest. You have to subpoena people, and you have to do examinations of individual people. Now, when we did that in Harris County in 2004, we found some illegal voting.
How many?
I don't remember. 8 votes changed.
Out of?
I think they ended up with a list of 120 people where they subpoenaed them and, drilled down to find out. And the fact is, the illegal voting, most of it was people voting that didn't actually live in that district, and they were voting in the wrong district.
So 8 out of a couple of million.
But as I say, it didn't change the outcome. Nothing about that examination suggests that there are hundreds, much less thousands, of illegal voters in Harris County, where we have 2.5 million voters. There's a handful of illegal voting in the sense that it's not in accordance with the law, which has to do with you don't get to vote in this particular race unless you live in this particular place. That's not a felony, it's a misdemeanor. We only found 1 felony, but that wasn't real because the guy had checked he wasn't a citizen. Yeah. So, on the other hand, until that contest was over, and it took the better part of 2 months, there were nothing but rumors running around about the election. Now, one thing I think my Republican colleague would be surprised is I rather appreciate in these huge elections the effect of photo ID. Most Democrats vote with their photo ID, and it's very fast, and it massively cuts down on anybody spreading these rumors about illegal voting. Because you couldn't have hundreds of thousands of people voting illegally unless the Department of Public Safety was completely incompetent.
Yeah, and it makes sense. You should have to prove who you are to vote. If you have to show an ID to buy cigarettes or alcohol or get on a plane or enter a federal building or the courthouse, showing your ID to vote it keeps the system fair, honest, and you should show who you are to vote. Absolutely.
So I don't want to. Go ahead.
Well, let's get real. You have half the people in this country don't vote at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other half the people, well, a quarter, at least half of the people who are voting vote with holding their nose. They do it as an obligation. It's their citizenship. The idea that there are large numbers of people here illegally who aren't citizens or who are wanting to go and risk a felony conviction in order to vote is just ridiculous.
And if you're genuinely concerned about illegal voting, what you want to do, and what we have not done in Texas, is see to it that everybody here is fully documented. So that you pull out your driver's license and says, gosh, he's a Danish citizen. But we have enormous numbers of people in Texas who live in an underground economy where they're not documented. And there are all sorts of reasons to not be documented. The documentation we use is very, very biased. I mean, why would you have a driver's license if you don't have a car
So
or insurance? I mean, it's so we, you know, but authenticating voters is a good idea. Authenticating citizens is a good idea. Authenticating everybody is a good idea. Then everybody could have a bank account.
So let's ask this question. So you talk about absentee votes.
Mm-hmm.
Are those ever recounted?
I'm sorry, what?
Absentee votes, are they recounted?
Yes, you can request a recount of just the absentee votes. That's much less expensive. And you know, if a race was down to 1 or 2 or 8 or 16 votes, that would be worth looking at, because there is some subjectivity in how those markings on a piece of paper are interpreted by the scanner and the people looking at the scanner. But, and as I say, that happened in one of the races on my watch, and they found one vote that neither side was sure of, so the winner just said, fine, you can have it.
So do you need an ID to vote absentee?
No, you do not need an ID to vote absentee. You have to be registered or get registered. The flakiest part of it is the federal postcard application for a mail ballot, which is handled through the military and the consulates. That would be pretty easy to steal. Yeah. Also in Polk County, Texas, there are 17,000 voters in one precinct, which is actually an RV park, and nobody has ever been able to find hardly any of those people. They all vote absentee, and they apparently live all over the country. But there's no way under state law to go after them, and the federal government's never been interested in finding out whether they're committing mail fraud.
So do we have any, as far as you know here in the county, Green, Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian, any efforts from any one of the parties to challenge, to get a different means of actually voting? I mean, you mentioned earlier, John, that the machines are old, right? We think of them as something modern because they're electronic, whereas some people are still using punch cards. But is there any effort to try to upgrade these machines, the cost involved?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a very elaborate effort that really comes out of the work at Rice University to develop an electronically recorded, voter-verified election system that runs on commercial off-the-shelf machines, so that are very inexpensive. I mean, our voting machines cost about 20 times what this does, and this is a very fancy cell phone. No, you can get much better hardware if you design a software system with military-grade encryption that uses commercial off-the-shelf technology. The bids are due the 16th of December in Austin. They've done that in Austin. I mean, the Travis County clerk and computer scientists from all over the country have collaborated on designing a system that would be much less expensive and orders of magnitude more secure than really anything anybody's using in the country. I mean, I'd be very proud as a Texan if that effort succeeds.
The Green Party has, it sounds like, has been asking for that sort of thing, where it's voter verified, it's a paper trail, it's something that can be recounted.
What is voter verified? What is that?
The voter says, yeah, I see that's, the marking on that piece of paper is what I thought it was going to be. And then it gets somehow put it into the pile of papers that are being saved to be counted. So that's my understanding of voter verified. Maybe that's not right, but that's my understanding. Where at least you could, because there have been examples, and they have been examples here in Harris County, where somebody said, you know, and whether this is apocryphal or not, I don't know, said, you know, I put in George Bush and it came out Al Gore. I don't understand it. I kept doing it. It kept coming out Al Gore. Could be just a fluke, but the point is that it's important to have people voting. If you want confidence in the democratic process, it's important for people to feel as though their votes are actually being counted correctly. And it's important for them to know that if there's any question, it can be looked at and checked going back after the fact. And so one way to do that is what my understanding was of well, two things. Have a separate paper trail, which can be counted, which is not an electronic system, which, if you're clever enough, maybe you can figure out a way to hack. And then do the comparison between those two things.
Is there any way to go back? Let's say, Murad, you walked in and you said, you know what your slate was, right? And 2 weeks from now, is there any way to go back and verify that you, in fact, voted, and we can check to make sure you voted for who you said you voted for?
No.
The answer is no, because we do not use the Australian ballot. We use an anonymous ballot.
Right.
So once you've cast a regular ballot, I mean, you couldn't, there's no way for you to find your ballot. Now, in the star vote system in Travis County, voter verification takes place at the time you vote. You get a little slip of paper, you can see what it says, and you drop that in a can like you used to do with the ballots. And then 2 weeks later, whenever it's over, you have a little numbered slip. You can go on a website and the website will tell you, yes, your ballot was counted, but it won't tell you what you voted for, because then your boss or all kinds of people can extort money from you. So you have to either have a secret ballot, which is what I'm in favor of, or an anonymous ballot, which is what we actually have.
So we're all talking about recount. We're talking about voter fraud, right? What does that do to our democracy? What does that do? What does that say about, you've served, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that you protect or took an oath to protect. And outside of safety, it was what we stand for, and that's democracy, which is based on the fundamental right for people to participate in our elections. So what does that say when we talk about voter fraud, we talk about recount? What does that say for our democracy?
Well, I think one of the things that the talk about voter fraud, when there's really no real evidence of it in any significant way, has been used to justify ways of keeping people from voting. So the voter ID thing is one thing, but I'm told in this election that people are being taken off the rolls in one state because somebody with their name voted in another state, not being checked to see whether in fact there were two people with the same
But
name.
you can't substantiate that claim.
What's that?
But you're not able to.
I'm not. That's what I hear. It's certainly the case in the Florida election, for instance, that large numbers of people were taken off the rolls because they were supposed to be felons. In Florida, apparently you can't vote if you're a felon, and they weren't. So their efforts are made to restrict voting, by the people who are in power in a given state. If it doesn't look like it's going to go their way, they try to restrict the votes for the people who don't think they're going to vote for them. And that's been happening. And that is really a problem for democracy, because if we're serious about it, we really have to seriously try to make it easy for people to vote, try to make it possible that people will want to vote. We might even consider doing what the Australians do, which is to say make it illegal not to vote.
What do you think? Right.
Voter fraud absolutely exists. There is, I mean, to say that there's no voter fraud or, we've caught 20 cases over the past few years, so it's insignificant. That's just what we've caught. Voter fraud exists. I think in order to make it more, to put more confidence in the system, we have to have checks and balances in place, like voter ID laws, like continuing to streamline the system to where you can't hack the machines, or to where people who vote are the ones who actually voted, and also double checking, because how do you know if, say, somebody passed away and they're still registered to vote? Checks and balances to where, okay, Jane Doe passed away, that registration is now void, so that someone else can't use it. I think the easiest way to cheat the system is with absentee ballots, because those go out in the mail and then they get mailed back in. So anybody who intercepts that and votes that ballot can mail it in. But the way that not anybody can get an absentee ballot, supposedly, here in Texas. You have to be active duty military or senior citizen or have a handicap to where, it would prevent you from going to the polls. And that's what absentee ballots are for. So it'd be very difficult to regulate that. But I think if we continue to streamline the system, use technology, make it more difficult to cheat, and use voter ID laws, we can do the best we can. And that's what we can do.
John?
I think that there are two things that can be done there are three things. The easiest thing to do is to preserve and protect the tradition, the custom, the conventions that have people from both parties at every step of the way watching everything. That's called invigilation. And that's a principle in every aspect of voting. Remember, we were voting in Texas before we even had a constitution. We had to vote to adopt the Constitution. Well, you have this tradition of people who disagree, nonetheless, watching each other and trusting but verifying. That's neither machines nor bureaucracies or lawyers or courts should break that up. That's a very fine tradition that's very old, goes back to Roman times, and we need to keep that intact. There are also organizations like the League of Women Voters who have partisans from both parties who agree to talk civilly to each other and make elections work because it's patriotic, not because they agree on anything. Well, again, those kinds of patriotic institutions, to my mind, are the key to making elections work, because you will never write rules that cover everything. So those traditions and customs are very valuable. I think we have one particular problem that I don't see anyone addressing, much less solving. The fact is, Hamilton and Jefferson did not agree on how to establish armed forces or define the right to vote. They argued day and night over that. The Constitution just punted on that. People are still arguing today, is the right to vote a privilege or is it a responsibility? This is not decided. We're still having that 18th century argument right now. The countries where there's very little of this sort of argument are the ones that, one way or the other, have very settled traditions of voting and of military formation. Canada and Australia have one style, but they don't argue over voting or whether or how or when you serve in the military. In Switzerland, Israel, Germany, it's different because voting is attached to an obligation to serve in the military. In our Texas Constitution, that's what we have. We have the Swiss Roman doctrine of your right to vote is coterminous with your obligation to show up and serve in the military. But our statute entirely reflects the Federalist Whig doctrine of property owners and taxpayers have earned the right to vote, and people who are not property owners and taxpayers don't deserve the right to vote. We still have that argument. It's not abated since Hamilton and Jefferson went on and on about it. So, which I will now stop doing.
No, but you were about to say something.
I do believe that in the United States, if you're 18 or older and you're a citizen, you vote. I mean, I think that's what it currently stands. So I don't know about any debate that's going on, but if you're 18 and you're a citizen, you can vote and you don't have to vote.
If you're 18 and a citizen, you're eligible to vote in the state of Texas, but you can't vote unless you're registered, which is not universal or unbiased. And even if you're registered and eligible, you have to be qualified to vote before you actually get a ballot. And those three steps, eligibility, registration, and qualification, they're what's called a Markov chain. And when you get through all of that, guess what?
What's the qualification?
What?
What's the qualification other than showing up?
Yeah.
The qualification is you have to be in this book, or we have to call downtown, and you have to have this and that and the other. I didn't bring that chart. It's extremely complicated to actually get a ballot that gets counted in this state.
And unfortunately, we won't have time to get into it, but there's some really good questions. And we can all see that not only are we very impassioned about our democracy and our ability to cast our ballot and cast our right to vote, to participate, we can see that it's important that we also believe in it, right? So on behalf of the League of Women Voters, Houston area, and Houston Media Source, I want to thank you for tuning in to this edition of Public Affairs, Public Access Recount. And my name is Quentin Wiltz with the League. Thank you for tuning in.